All right, this one is going to be a little bit longer than usual, but it's because there's so much information about this that you need to know about. In last week's sermon, I spoke about several things in Earth's geology and topography that prove that Noah's flood really happened. Waterfalls all came from the flood, and none of them can possibly be millions of years old, or they'd already be long gone by now. Grand Canyon couldn't have possibly been formed by a little river flowing uphill for many miles before it could start flowing downhill again. Rivers only flow downhill. And coal can be created rather quickly in laboratories and don't require millions of years to form. Well, this week, I'm going to continue where I left off by looking at radiometric dating, such as carbon dating. We've all been taught in school that radiometric dating methods, such as carbon dating, are absolute concrete ways of empirically knowing how old something is. It's one of the only things that Darwinists hang their hat on as being empirical proof for their theory. Yet proving the age of something has absolutely nothing to do with proving that animals somehow evolved into other animals. Those are two totally different ideas. Nobody can empirically prove that coal takes millions of years to form. Instead, our modern technology proves that we can coalify things today in factories. And nobody can empirically prove that it took millions of years for diamonds to form either. Synthetic gems of all kinds have been created by modern technology for decades now. If modern man can create synthetic gems that look as good or even better than natural gems, then why insist that the natural ones must have taken millions of years? That's really very illogical. This leads me to carbon dating. Did you know that when they use carbon dating on coal and diamonds, they find that they still have carbon-14 in them? You're probably thinking, so what, right? Well, that's because you probably have no idea how carbon dating even works. All you know is they carbon date something and it tells them how old that thing is, right? But what's the actual science behind carbon dating? How does it work? Does it work? How reliable is it really? I'll explain in layman's terms how it works, and then you'll see that finding carbon-14 in diamonds or coal should be impossible if Darwinism, or better yet, what I call Saganism, were true. Let me quickly explain that word. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, there was a guy on TV named Carl Sagan, who was famous for saying things were billions and billions of years old. It was kind of a catchphrase for him. So I've coined that term, Saganism, to be the belief in millions or billions of years. Just like Darwinism is the belief in animals evolving into other animals, Saganism is the belief in millions or billions of years of Earth's history. The concept of carbon dating is part of a bigger concept called radiometric dating. What it does is it measures how much of a radioactive element something has in it, and then that measurement then supposedly tells them how old the thing is. Carbon dating is actually one of many kinds of dating. There are also potassium-argon dating, uranium-lead dating, and several other kinds that I don't feel like trying to pronounce. But they all work the same way, only using different elements. The basic way it works is this. The Earth's atmosphere has a certain amount of carbon-14 in it. What's carbon-14? Carbon is one of the elements on the periodic table of elements, but its atomic weight is only 12.01, not 14. The next element after carbon is nitrogen, which does have an atomic weight of 14.01. What happens is the sun affects the nitrogen atoms, and it becomes unstable or radioactive. The atomic value goes from nitrogen 14.01 down to carbon 14, and it continues to decay until it finally reaches carbon 12.01. So basically what that means is that the sun slowly turns nitrogen into carbon. All of the dating methods work the same way. Uranium decays into lead. Potassium decays into argon. Now, let me take this time to point something out. Do you remember back when I first started this series that one of the things I mentioned was that all the elements starting from hydrogen and helium at the supposed Big Bang would have had to have evolved from each other to eventually evolve the entire periodic table of elements. Somehow, hydrogen and helium would have to become lithium, the third element, and then beryllium, the fourth element, and then boron, the fifth element, and then carbon, the sixth element, and then nitrogen, the seventh element, and so on, until all 118 elements were in existence. There would need to be a natural way of these elements moving up the table of elements instead of down. But all we ever see is radioactive decay. The entire concept of radiometric dating depends on it. It is logically impossible to believe in chemical evolution based on the entire concept of radioactive decay. Now, getting back to carbon dating, these radioactive elements, such as carbon, uranium, or potassium, have what is called a half-life. That means that they have empirically measured how long it takes for half of the carbon to decay down towards a stable carbon-12 atom. The difference between all the various dating methods is the half-life. Carbon-14's half-life is relatively short, at only 5,700 years, while the half-life of uranium-238 is 4.5 billion years. What that means is that carbon dating is used for things that are generally young, while all the others are used for things that are supposedly millions or billions of years old. Carbon dating is the only one that measures in the thousands instead of millions. In theory, virtually all of the carbon-14 should be gone easily under 50,000 years. 10 half-lives would be 57,000 years, and would reduce it down to 1,024th, which is virtually gone as far as I'm concerned. What this means is that anything that is supposedly older than 50,000 years shouldn't have any significant amount of carbon-14 in it. And certainly anything that's supposedly many millions of years old, like dinosaur bones or coal or diamonds, should have no carbon-14 at all. But that's not what we find. All of those things have been found to have measurable amounts of carbon-14 in them. It is scientifically impossible, according to their own scientific method of carbon dating, for diamonds or coal or dinosaurs to be millions of years old. Now that should be the end of the debate right there, but there's more information about radiometric dating that needs to be understood, so you can see that it's not nearly as reliable as we were taught in the textbooks. Radiometric dating is based on several mathematical assumptions. If any of those assumptions are wrong, it greatly affects the test results. These assumptions aren't able to be empirically known. They have to assume them. First of all, these methods have only been around since 1949. All of their assumptions are based on what we see today in the Earth's atmosphere. They have to assume that the atmosphere was the same long ago. They have to assume that the amount of carbon-14 back then was the same amount we have today. They also have to assume how much carbon-14 would have been in the thing being tested when it first existed. If I showed you a lit candle and asked you when it was first lit, you can measure how fast it burns, but you can never tell me how tall it was to begin with. Even by measuring the amount of wax at its base, how do you know somebody didn't remove some of that wax? There are a lot of assumptions built into radiometric dating, and they're all based on the belief in the unproven geologic column from 1830, and from the unproven belief in billions of years. So here's some information that they didn't tell us in our textbooks. All of the dating results that they publish are cherry-picked to fit their beliefs. The actual results that come back are all over the place, and they pick only the ones that fit their narrative. Here's a quote from a guy who used to do the actual testing. He said, "If a date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we put it in a footnote. And if it is completely out of date, we just drop it." Do you get that? The dates they publish are frauds. The date has to support their theories, or else they just drop it. How can anyone possibly trust the dates they publish when they just pick and choose which dates they want? Another quote is from another guy who says that the troubles of radiocarbon dating are undeniably deep and serious. The method depends on a fix-it-as-we-go approach. Fully half the dates are rejected. There are gross discrepancies. And the accepted dates are actually selected dates. Do you see? We don't get to see the actual results from carbon dating. We only get to see the results that they want us to see, just as long as it fits their Darwinist worldview. Here's some interesting things that have been dated that didn't get cherry-picked and totally show how it actually doesn't work. When it was first invented in 1949, they tested 2 parts of a mammoth. They said the leg was 15,380 years old, but the skin was 21,300 years old. It's the same animal. Both numbers should be the same. 14 years later, in 1963, they carbon dated living mollusk shells. They were still alive, but the dating method claimed they were 2,300 years old. In 1971, a freshly killed seal was carbon dated as being 1,300 years old. In 1984, living snails were carbon dated as being 27,000 years old. In 1992, two mammoths found right next to each other were carbon dated. One was 22,000 years old, and the other was 16,000 years old. Both numbers can't be true. How do you know if either number is correct? You don't. Here's something interesting. When a guy tried to date a caveman fossil, which was expected to be at least 250,000 years old, the tests kept coming back as only being between 27,000 and 53,000 years old. Isn't that interesting? This not only proves that the cavemen aren't 250,000 years old, it also proves that the dating methods are not even close to being an exact science, seeing as the results produced a 96% margin of error between 27,000 and 53,000. Here's another one like that. A German professor had been claiming that he had found a skull of an ancient German from 27,400 years ago. Oxford University stepped in and found the skull was from an elderly man who died in 1750. The professor had also been claiming for 30 years that a certain skeleton was 21,300 years old. Oxford University tested it and claimed it was only 3,300 years old. The professor was tried by his university panel and exposed his frauds, and he resigned in 2005 in total disgrace. People lie trying to make up evidence for Darwinism. Why would you trust a theory with so much outright fraud behind it? In 1975, one part of a mammoth was carbon dated at 29,500 years old, and another part of the same mammoth at 44,000 years old. The same animals produced 2 very different results, same animal. Which one is right? Is either one right? Also in 1975, Rand McNally claimed that a particular layer of the Earth was dated to be 300,000 years old. But then they said it had a potential error factor of plus or minus 300,000 years. How does that make any sense? It could be 300,000 years old, it could be 600,000 years old, or it could be 0 years old. This is ridiculous. This isn't science. It's guesswork. In an official Alaskan Geological Survey paper, they claimed that sample number SI 454 was about 17,000 years old. Then they said that sample SI 455 was about 24,000 years old. Then the footnotes say that both samples were from the same animal. How is that possible? It isn't. Then the same report claimed that a particular tree stump was less than 20,000 years old. And right under it, it said that the same sample was more than 28,000 years old. So the same sample is both younger than 20,000 and older than 28,000 at the same time. I'm sure you can see that's not logically possible. Living penguins were dated as being 8,000 years old. We know they don't live that long. They only live between 6 and 20 years. And in 1972, the material from layers where dinosaurs were found were carbon dated to only be 34,000 years old. But dinosaurs are supposed to be at least 65 million years old. Why then are the layers they're found in only dating as being 34,000 years old? Another guy, an actual scientist from Russia, carbon dated actual dinosaur bones, and they came back as being under 30,000 years old. A guy in Columbus, Ohio, brought dinosaur bones to a lab to be tested, but he didn't tell them that they were dinosaur bones. They carbon dated them as only being 20,000 years old. Then he told them they were dinosaur bones, and they said that they couldn't have been only 20,000 years old, and they'd have to test them again. They said if he would have told them they were dinosaur bones, then they wouldn't have carbon dated them. But they did carbon date them, and the scientific results showed that they were not even close to being 65 million years old. So does carbon dating even work? If they were supposedly wrong about these dinosaur bones, then how do you know they're right about anything else? An archaeologist excavated some burnt wood and took 2 samples to a lab to be carbon dated. Sample A was on top and dated to be 3,000 years old. Sample B was found below sample A and was dated as being 4,000 years old. Makes sense, right? The lower sample would supposedly be older, right? Well, the guy waited 6 months and then switched the samples and brought them back to the same lab. Then they said that sample A, which was actually the original sample B, was 3,000 years old, and sample B, which was the original sample A, was 4,000 years old. Explain that. One of the guys who went to the moon brought back samples of moon rock. The results varied from being only 10,000 years old all the way to 2.5 billion and 4.6 billion years old. That's a pretty wide margin of error. Here's another quote from people who do potassium-argon dating. They said, "It is common to discard ages that are too high or too low compared with the rest of the group, or with other available data such as the geological time scale." See? They make sure the test results fit within their imaginary geologic column chart from 1830. They don't let the empirical results correct the chart. They use the chart to cherry pick the empirical results. That's not science, it's fraud. Now let's talk about volcanoes for a bit. A volcanic eruption created something called the KBS tuff, Tuff, which is a layer of ash from the eruption. They used potassium argon dating on it a bunch of times, and everyone agreed that it was over 200 million years old. A couple years later, though, another scientist digs underneath the KBS tuff and finds a modern human skull. How does a skull from a modern human end up buried in rock underneath layers that are supposedly 200 million years old? Keep in mind that they claim modern humans didn't evolve until only a few million years ago at the most. We're talking about over 200 million. So what did they do? They tested the KBS tuft again. And lo and behold, now all of a sudden the results come back that it's only 500,000 to 2.5 million years old. At first, potassium argon claimed it was 212 million years old. Then after the skull was found and dated as almost 3 million years old, then the potassium argon atoms suddenly claim that they are only 2.5 million years old, which perfectly fits with the skull story. If you can't see the corruption in this science, I don't know what to tell you. A few more things about volcanoes. When they erupt, the chemical changes that happen start the clock over for radiometric dating. Therefore, when it erupts, it should come back as 0 years old. But Mount Etna in Sicily erupted back in 122 BC. And the potassium argon dating came back as it happening 250,000 years ago. Whoops. It erupted again in 1964, and the test results said it was 700,000 years ago. Even a third time in 1972, and it came back as 350,000 years ago. A Hawaiian volcano erupted in 1801, but came back as 1.6 million years ago. Whoops again. Another volcano in Hawaii erupted in 1959, but came back as 8.5 million years ago. How about Mount St. Helens in 1980? They tested it with 5 different kinds of testing and came back with 5 different results, ranging from 350,000 years to 2.8 million years. It just happened. It just happened in 1980. I remember it when I was a kid. It should have come back as only 16 years when the test was done in 1996. Here's a bottom line for the science of radiometric dating. Whenever they know how old something really is, radiometric dating never works. But when they don't know how old something really is, then they assume that radiometric dating works. Do you not see how absurd that is? It never works empirically, but it always works hypothetically. Radiometric dating methods, like carbon dating, is not even close to being reliable. Don't let anyone tell you that it proves anything about the age of the Earth or fossils or anything else. It's all just part of the devil's scam known as Darwinism, trying to trick you into thinking that God didn't really create you. You're not an animal. You're a human being made in the image of God, and He wants you on His team.